Our next presenter is Ian Gereg. He's a part-time private agriculturist. He's going to be talking about design habits for avian enrichment.
All right, it looks like I'm ready to roll. Again, my name is Ian Gereg. I'm from up here in Pennsylvania. The majority of my background is in waterfowl, but I did have the pleasure of working in an AZA facility with a whole variety of other birds as well. So today I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk generally about enrichment considerations and enclosure design across all birds. So to start, planning is everything. It's much easier to think outside the box when the box isn't built. It's often less costly as well, and certainly less disruptive to the birds. As many of you know, there's certain parts of the year that you really don't want to be doing a lot of construction or renovation around birds. And it's nice to be able to do that ahead of time. In my personal situation here, I'm right in the middle of this. We're in the middle of building a new facility here. So I'm really thinking this through again. So the timing of this presentation is really good. Again, having the space and time to think about this stuff ahead of trying to retrofit an enclosure really helps with kind of broadening your ability to create a diverse enrichment program, and then also identify those areas where you can be less disruptive ahead of time. First and foremost, if you take nothing from this, I would emphasize know your natural history. It's really important as you're planning enrichment that you know what your birds want to do, can do. And I think there's two really great resources that I would highlight in this. And the first is eBird. If you're not familiar with eBird, it is run by Cornell and it's free. You can't really beat that. An incredible resource as you're planning ahead. To look through this, look at all the different photos, videos, sounds, all these wonderful resources that you have there to really help you plan for appropriate enrichment. There's also Birds of the World by Cornell. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, this is the former Handbook of Birds of the World online, HBW Alive, I think it was called. Cornell is now running that as well. Again, an incredible resource and a great investment. I do not work for Cornell. I do not get any sort of commission for saying this, but it's super cheap. At less than $50 a year, it's a really great investment and gives you even more resources. And I would say that if you're working with species that are non-North American, it's particularly nice because you can really learn quite a bit about those species and hone your enrichment program to them. So just as an example of this, and I know there's probably a lot of eyes being rolled that you chose Canada geese, but still, for a super common species like this, for example, there are 350,000 photos alone. And it looks like 580 videos. So I just took a quick screenshot here to show you what you could learn just from just a few photos. Of course, I'm just going to go through here a little bit delayed, my apologies. But we look at these two photos of them roosting or loafing, and it's very clear that these birds want to be in shallow water. They want to be in wide open areas where they can see farther and feel safer. So as you think about where you might set these birds up in a swimming location, it looks like they'd really want to be in an open area. As we move along here, nesting, if you're planning on having this species with the ability to nest as part of your enrichment program, you can see it's created a large peaked nest there. You see what the nesting material is, and you can see that they're nesting outside of a group. So you're going to want those animals to have the space to do that. Of course, we all know that geese eat grass, but here's an example of the height of that grass that they're consuming. There we go. You start to see their social interactions and the habitats they like to use. So again, this is completely free. This is probably a really easy example because it's a super common species. But even for odd, obscure species that are found anywhere in the world, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of photos of each of these birds. So a really great opportunity, again, to get that good base as you start to build your exhibits with enrichment in mind. Enclosure height and shape. You know, I often say bigger is better, but there are certainly limitations to that. Obviously, there are safety challenges to the birds. If they can't fly, maybe you don't want them to get that high on perching. If you live in an area where you're going to need to climb up on this thing in icy weather, obviously you need to think about your own safety as well. You need to think about the structural soundness of an enclosure. Certainly lots to think about there, but I would generally say build it as large as you can based on the species, the natural history, your budget, and of course your climate. Peaked versus flat roofs. This really depends again on your species and your plan there. I really love peaked roofs, particularly for birds like your passerines or your raptors that may utilize that different height as part of their daily routine. They may want that really tall, high vantage point for singing, for looking out over the area around their enclosure. There's just a lot there that gives them choice and control as far as where they want to go when you have that height. This photo is a little bit of an extreme there, but you also want to plan for the shape of your future plantings and how they may grow up. This one, really, they built it right around an existing tree, but I just loved it as an example of, you know, using that full height and the fact that the birds inside this enclosure can use all of that space, whether it be horizontal or vertical. And then as far as enclosure shape for flight goes, you know, here's a situation where bigger is better. It's maybe not always true. There are some species that, if they get too much speed up, can actually injure themselves. So to give them that choice to fly for very long distances really isn't possible in a safe manner. So you need to think that through as well. And along those same lines, I would say rounded edges. Anytime you can create them with furniture, with plantings, whatever it may be, is really going to help protect you from any of those risky situations where a bird gets trapped there for a number of reasons, whether it be being picked on by another bird, feeling unwell and trying to hide in that spot where you may miss them. There's just a lot of ways that you want to avoid that and a number of reasons why. Some more examples of that peaked concept that I was talking about there and why I like it so much. You can see here on the right, these whistling ducks have perching at various heights there, and they can continue to choose which height they want to go to, whether they want to look out over the outside of the exhibit or stay closer to the vegetation. And you can see that the perches are created in a diagonal manner there where they can actually get up and choose that as they go. The center picture there, I really like the fact that you've got not only the peaked roof where the birds can choose to go up to whatever height they want, but the plants inside are also doing the same. So you've got a really kind of complex ecosystem, if you will, there for the birds to choose where they want to go. Accessibility. This is a big one, and it's always that like should have had a V8 moment. We all want to put really cool plants or really cool furniture in our exhibits and be able to change that out. But there's always this limitation of, boy, I wish we had a bigger door or a longer hallway or some way to get this in. And one of the things that I've found is really helpful is to identify ahead of time a panel that can be removed, unbolted, unscrewed, whatever it is, that is easily accessible to you and to equipment that you can move the birds out temporarily, put in whatever large stuff you want, and then be able to close that up securely again. If you think about general doorways, plan for what a wheelbarrow might fit or a skid steer bucket if you're really lucky, and just use those dimensions as you start to plan for how you're going to build these spaces, because it's really important if you want to be able to change this stuff or make things, you know, as big and naturalistic as you can, having that opportunity. And I would also highlight hallways. Really, you want to be able to get into these spaces securely, so that the birds have no risk of escape or injury during that process, but also have them long and wide enough that you can bring in really big pieces of wood or new plants or whatever it might be. And it's particularly important if you're looking at things like the tops of trees and more complex spaces that you might want for perching. So you're one of those things that I feel like over the years I've not done a good job at. But as I start to plan ahead in this new project, certainly being aware of what is removable, where it is, and knowing that we have those spaces in the future for updating furniture. Lighting, pretty basic, but something that you really need to think about in an outdoor space and an indoor space. And again, it's choice. It's not just, am I in the sun or out of the sun? It's that dappled light in between. How does the light change throughout the day? And really whether the birds want to utilize that or not. You can see the toucan in the top right here. It's choosing to be in that kind of mid zone, sort of in the light, sort of out of the light, and it can choose to slide up or down that perch to get into whatever zone it wants to be in. The pool in the middle of the screen there, you can see that you've got that spectrum of light from full light with no cover over the birds to really dappled shaded light with cover above under the philodendron there on the right. So really giving that choice there is important as you're laying these things out. And again, remember that the sun moves throughout the day and that the birds should be able to move with that light should they choose to. The one age class of birds that I think we often sort of forget about or don't put as much emphasis on this choice in lighting with are your young birds. So I included this photo down here on the bottom right there. Just it's an image of a grazing enclosure for young geese, and it has a solid panel on the top that's shaded there. The intent is that throughout the day, those birds can choose to be in the sun or not, and that panel is going to move throughout the day. It's wide enough, move the shade throughout the day so the birds continue to have it. So again, just think about through all your age classes, providing that access to natural light if you can. The neighborhood. So obviously what we build inside our enclosures is really important, but what is going on outside them is equally so, sometimes even more. You can build the most wonderful enclosure in the world, but if there's a lot of negative stimulation outside that enclosure, you really have defeated the purpose. So I just highlighted some unique situations here in these photos that I wanted to point out. Clearly on the bottom left here, you've got this group of geese that's quite calm with human visitation. And really what's going on around them on a public pathway here doesn't seem to be disturbing them. Half those birds haven't even lifted their head up. On the other extreme, but I guess it's still a comfortable bird up there in the top right, these pelicans where a zoo guest could actually sit and contemplate life holding a pelican's shoulder might be a little extreme. But again, the birds are very comfortable with that. And then you've got something like this cat penguin situation going on here in the bottom right. This is an example of, while the penguin does not seem concerned, this is an external risk factor that I would not want to encourage. So again, considering what those interactions might be with the world around them, and then how you can manage them in a way that is stimulating to the birds, but also keeping them safe. Again, I'm going to mention the sun here a lot, but really consider what that sun's course is throughout the day, and giving those birds the chance to move around that as it changes through the day. And again, you've got certain species that are really cued in visually, so maybe a raptor versus something. I don't know. I'm just thinking of another species that might be more cued into sounds or smells, maybe a turkey vulture, and where you'd want to place that enclosure from an enrichment standpoint, whether they be overstimulated, understimulated, or somewhere in between. And of course, when you want to control the neighborhood around an enclosure, I think barriers are really helpful. But you do want to think about what are you restricting by putting up barriers, and then what are you protecting the birds from? Obviously, you need to think about the bird safety, but also are those enclosure barriers going to hold up to the various elements, whether they be wind or snow or whatever it might be? And of course, from a safety perspective, you want to think about not only is the bird going to hurt itself up against it, but could the bird actually injure itself where the mesh or the wire meets the barrier? So I brought this photo in on the top right here to show that this goose, while the barrier works and she can peer over it if she'd like to, she could actually get her head stuck here. So, best of intent, but there's a potential issue there. So it's thinking all those things through when you're creating these barriers to ensure that it's safe not only for the bird, but also functional. So in a whole bunch of different designs here, of course, you've got the concrete solid wall, plywood. This boxwood hedge looks really nice, but obviously more costly than something like plywood. I saw one person that came up with this really cool galvanized metal with a black rubber lip on it to protect the edge. That was actually on the outside, so the birds couldn't touch it. But I thought that was kind of a neat design. And then you've got the stockade type fences that have ventilation so the wind can't blow right through them. And then your natural fences like bamboo and reed, which from a distance really do break up sight, but up close are not quite as effective. Shelter. This is always interesting and really quite species specific. So obviously exposure to the rain and the choice to enter the rain or into the sun or the snow, whatever it might be, is species specific. But I think within their own temperature parameters, I think it's great to give the birds choice where you can. But when you're building, you want to be able to integrate both your natural and your artificial shelters. Some individual birds, some species tend to pick one over the other. And again, planning using the natural history, because you could build the most ornate, beautiful, welcoming shelter in the world, but if it's not in a location where those birds are going to use it, for example, putting a shelter on the ground for these pigeons, it's going to be entirely ineffective. So really planning that based on their natural history is really important. If you are using natural windbreaks, or I'm sorry, natural shelter, think about what the goal is again. Are you breaking the wind? Do you want the birds to go under there? Is it dense enough to keep warm? Is it supposed to protect them from rain? Again, if you're in a climate that's full of more deciduous trees, what's going to happen during the winter? So there's a lot of complexity to shelter. And I think the best answer there is a combination of both natural and artificial. But again, ensuring that it meets the birds' natural history requirements and that the birds are actually comfortable with it. Sometimes that can take some time, but don't make it harder on yourself or the birds by forcing something that's not going to line up with them. For those of us that are up north, snow load, again, is a concern. Make sure it's safe. Make sure it's not going to bring down the enclosure. And then, is it sized right? So these black swans, they chose to nest under this shelter. So for this, yes, because it's the stationary single bird, typically the male obviously wanted to be in this photo, but you know, this is a situation where you'd want to build this to the appropriate size for a pair of swans if it was actually a shelter, and think about placement a little differently than if it was a nesting site. So again, just make sure it's sized right to the species. Enclosure mesh. Mesh is a tough one. There's a lot of different variables there. Obviously, it needs to keep your species in, but it can also create really another vertical wall for them, and for you, for perching, for enrichment, all those things. And I would say that just as you're planning your enclosure, make sure that you're creating a mesh or using a mesh that is going to fit all or tick all the boxes there, and be effective to, number one, keep your birds safe and in the enclosure, but keep any pests out, any potential rivals or predators out. But then also, are there positives to creating a little bit larger mesh to let insects in, to let you know, natural vegetation grow through it, whatever it might be. There's a balance there in my mind that you need to find. And again, think about, will it support anything? Some of the loose woven meshes will not hold perching as well as the rigid. If birds are going to accidentally fly into it at times, obviously the softer meshes are more valuable there. But there are some real enrichment opportunities on planning for the right mesh. Vegetation's a big one. I think great vegetation really makes or breaks an enclosure as far as exhibit complexity goes. But there's some planning that goes with it. You know, obviously planning for species of plants that are suitable to your climate is really important, but also how you're going to plant them. Have you amended the soil? How deep can these roots get? So that's a particular concern if you're working indoors. How is your exhibit design ahead of time to actually accept plant roots as they grow? And then, of course, to get rid of water. I mean, it's important to give plants water, but they also need to be able to drain that water off. So thinking about drainage and weep holes and stone, and how to get those into the enclosure and get those plants established before the birds go in. But just, 2 examples here of enclosures that have really nice vegetation that really makes them and gives those birds a lot of choice on where they go and what they do. And I think that's really a relatively low cost investment when it comes to your enrichment. So just something to think about certainly ahead of time. And again, all this is far easier to do when planning than it is to come back later. If you're doing any sort of hanging baskets or anything like that, yes, they have to support the weight of the plant, but will those hooks support the weight of that plant in 3 months of growing when it's fully saturated with water? And again, that's bird safety, that's staff safety, that's a whole bunch of things going on there to consider with your anchors ahead of time, and just to be prepared for that, because hopefully your plants are going to grow. Obviously, your birds are going to work against you in some regards when it comes to growing plants, and I think that choosing species that are durable and having backups is important. This Boston fern here, if you wanted to have 3 of those and change it out every month, that might be a better choice than just trying to will one of them to survive for a season. And then, of course, you get into toxicity of vegetation, certainly something to plan ahead on as you plan your enrichment. Exposure to toxic plants is something that you should talk to with your vet. There are lots of conflicting information sources on the web. For those of you fortunate to work in a zoo, often there are zoo resources there, and some of those are shared between institutions. But again, double check that stuff. And I'd also say, think about the species you're putting in there. Some of those species aren't really going to bother plants. Others are. So it's really important that you look at that in advance and really double check it. Perching. How can we get this far without talking about perching? There's a whole bunch of different perching planning, I think, that's really helpful to do ahead of time. And perching is not just branches and trees to me, really depending on your species. And again, as a duck guy, I'm going to highlight a lot of waterfowl things, but you've got elevated perches, you've got submerged perches, you've got floating perches. All of those things need some sort of anchor. So planning for those brackets, planning for the ability to change those out over time is really important. All this stuff looks great the day it goes in, and then a year later, that's when it gets complicated. So just planning ahead with things like brackets that allow you to pull the perching out and replace it are really nice. There is a small commercial version available for something, maybe an inch or a little bit wider. The application is not for birds, but it may work. I've seen people do the same thing at home with PVC. So there's some options there for those easily changeable perch holders that can get bolted on before the birds move in. Eye hooks are super helpful for perching. In this case, we used an eye hook for a former perching project to hang a nest box that a golden-breasted starling nested in. So those bolts and particularly eye bolts that are put in the walls ahead of time are really going to help you and let you be more creative throughout the lifespan of that exhibit. And then, of course, floating perches and things like that need to be anchored. So having an anchor in the base of your pools or on the edges of your pools are really important to getting those things to stay where you want them. I would just add that with any of this perching, you need to be cautious about how it's anchored and make sure that there's no chance that a bird's going to get a foot behind it, get caught in the anchor, or whatever it might be. Really think through any of the potential risks there. And again, as a duck guy, perching is not just for passerines. You've got obviously ducks up here, but one of the things I really like to do based on natural history is we know that waterfowl like to stand in shallow water. So what I do in my concrete pools is actually insert rocks while that concrete is still wet at 2 to 3 inches, sometimes longer, depending on the species, into the concrete while it's wet. They dry, and the birds love to perch on those. And it gives them a great opportunity to kind of, again, perform that natural history. Substrates are huge, obviously. I would say with substrates, there are some challenges, and I think anyone that's kept birds knows what these are, and it's, hygiene, controlling pests, and weather. The weather loves to wash away your sand or your stone or whatever it might be, mulch. But when you're considering, again, I'm going to go back to know your natural history. This plover is certainly going to want this muddy edge. From a hygiene standpoint, you really need to think about how often are you changing that muddy edge to create an opportunity for that bird to perform natural behaviors and get that enrichment from live vertebrates or whatever, invertebrates, sorry, that you might put in that mud, but still keep it hygienic. This hoopoe feeding in the sand, great for a probing species like that. But again, that sand is going to get grody at some point. So it's nice to have, the ability to get a wheelbarrow or a bucket in there to get that gone, but also a base to that enclosure, whether it be concrete or otherwise, that allows you to remove it easily. There are obviously other benefits other than foraging here. You've got dust bathing and things like that. So again, providing those spaces, not only from the substrate you choose, but also from a standpoint of, is it going to be dry enough for the birds to actually bathe in it? Can you remove it and put new stuff in? So there's a lot of complexities to this that can be addressed ahead of time. How do you keep it dry? How do you get it in and out? Where would you exactly want to put the various substrates ahead? And of course, if you've got something like these murs, big rocks would be great. But the first thing I think about when I see this enclosure is, boy, how do you clean that? So again, planning ahead on your water, which we're going to talk about in a minute, all that kind of integrates in with your substrates and what you choose. Nesting. This is a big one for me. I just feel like it's a component of enrichment and natural history that's often overlooked. I think even if you cannot, in a current situation, let your birds go from nest building all the way to chick fledging, there are opportunities there for them to go through some of those behaviors, and that is really a natural part of their cycle and something that we should encourage wherever possible. So again, in planning your exhibits, think about the nest building process. Is the nest material there? Are the sites that they would nest in available? Are the heights? Is it quiet enough? Is there, all those things that could provide them with that opportunity to fulfill a cycle of their life? Egg laying, again, do they have the proper location to do that? Are the birds going to disrupt their nest as they're trying to produce eggs? Natural incubation, of course, that's an incredible resource to allow the birds to do that, and parent rearing. There are obviously lots of challenges to parent rearing, but again, planning your space to be able to accommodate additional birds as they grow up is a great enrichment plan to do ahead of time. And of course, when you are planning for a much smaller and far less agile bird in your enclosure, as a chick would be, there are certainly new dangers that you need to plan for. Those chicks are going to be flightless. They might not be able to go up steps. They might not be able to get out of a water dish, whatever it may be. It's really planning for that. But again, like looking at those geese in that grazing enclosure I showed earlier, there are new enrichment opportunities. You've got kind of this little micro bird in there, and consider what that would look like from an enrichment perspective for them as well. And finally, with nesting, there's often that feedback that, oh boy, like I don't want to raise chicks. I don't have an outlet for them. I don't have the space. Well, I mean, my response is typically that one chick does the trick. Those birds are getting the same level of enrichment and behavioral stimulation raising that one bird as they would from raising a whole bunch. So if you can accommodate one, I think that's really great. So this is a bit out of order, but we're going back to lighting, and this is exclusively for indoor. So, birds indoors should have the same opportunities as those outdoors from a lighting perspective. but you have to think about how that really works indoors. And, one of the biggies is like UV light and full spectrum light. The birds need to be quite close to them to get the full functionality of them. So you need to think about how the bird can actually get to that height or that distance to really get all that they can out of it. There are UV transmitting panels that you can build enclosures with. So down here where these teal are perched on this grapevine, the top panels in this enclosure were actually UV transmitting. So as those birds moved up closer, they would actually be getting more UV exposure. But as you would with outdoors, you certainly want to maintain that choice in how birds utilize that light. Most of these sunbitterns, most of the day, are hiding in the shadows or tucked up. But to see these birds sunning inside was really encouraging to me. They were using that light to perform a natural behavior and certainly enriching them. So anytime you're looking inside at UV light, full spectrum, stuff like that, you're going to want to meter that as well. Check your levels to spend the money as you're designing your enclosures on UV transmitting light. UV transmitting panels, UV light. It's really important to make sure that you're actually creating an effective and useful amount of light. And these meters are relatively cheap and readily available, primarily for the reptile industry. But there's a lot out there on that, and some good evening reading if you haven't already read up on UV light. Well, how do you provide light? Well, you need electricity. I would say that when in doubt and you're building enclosures, put plenty of power sources nearby. Obviously, it's going to be case by case from what you're powering, but generally your normal voltage is going to be 120 volt and 15 amps. But will you need more for some other enrichment item? It's important to really look at that and plan ahead to ensure that you're going to be covering all of your needs in advance. Will you need to put this in the ground? Are you going to be putting it in conduit or UL cable? There's lots of options there. And again, far easier to plan this stuff ahead, to get it into walls, get it into, whatever it is that you need to get it into without disturbing the birds, creating a lot of dust, other potential risk factors that you certainly want to avoid. And of course, this is kind of a no-brainer, but if you're putting outlets outdoors, make sure that they're outdoor rated and covered. They should have GFIs. You should be able to trip them. They really need to be safe, not only for the birds so that they can't be accessible, but also for your staff. Just be careful with that stuff. And with electricity, there's tons of stuff that you can do with it from an enrichment standpoint. So just to have it there really provides a broader opportunity. You've got things like fans, including these really cool mister fans, bubblers if you've got pools, of course, basking lights and lamps like we talked about earlier, sound machines. Really the limit, there's really no limit to this. And it's essentially endless with all the ideas that you can come up with. But again, don't hamstring yourself by just not having the outlets nearby. And of course, from a fire safety standpoint, you really don't want to be running extension cords unless absolutely necessary, and they should be temporary. When you do run them, make them as short as possible. Just be safe with that stuff, and again, put an outlet in advance if you can. Of course, with electricity, there's lots of other uses. Cameras, that's really the new tech, really awesome stuff now. Heat lamps, timers, and of course, predator prevention. If you have electric fence or something like that on the outside of your enclosures, you're going to need electricity to power it reliably. Water, this is another one that planning in advance is really easy compared to retrofitting. So of course, your proximity to your water source is important. If you live up north, is it freeze protected? You need that water to be accessible to you and the birds throughout the year. If you are up north, making sure that any of your lines that are above ground can be winterized, drained out, or protected in some other way. But regardless of where you live and what you're doing with it, just make sure that your water sources and your lines are accessible. And really, as part of that, is making sure that they're documented as you put them in. So, you know, in this current construction project I have going, I have photos and drawings of every single water line, where it goes, what it ties into, and exactly where it lays, because I know that eventually I'm going to be digging this back up. And to have that in advance is really, really helpful. And it will be less disruptive to my birds and also to my sanity to know where that stuff is. With misting and rain systems, there's a lot of kind of DIY builds you can do with this. But again, you want to make sure that it's drainable for winterizing. You can suspend stuff like drip line at the top of enclosures, and it acts like a cheap rain system, works really well. There are thread-on mist heads that can go onto standard size hoses that are really great for that. But again, make sure that you've got water nearby. You've got a place for that water to go. You don't want to make a muddy mess. And then, of course, if you are up north, make sure that you can winterize it. And then if you are using any of the finer systems, like misting systems and anything more complex, these are typically things that I think of for indoor enclosures. Make sure that you have an RO system or a filter. Oops, going the wrong way here, sorry. Because you'll oftentimes have these small jets jam up. So again, just plan again for having those filter systems in place ahead of time, so they're not replacing all of the heads on your systems going forward. And then as far as water features, waterfalls, all those things, you know, again, know your natural history. If you've got species that like to dive as part of their natural behavior, it's nice to be able to replicate that. That's another source of enrichment for them. If they're shallow water foragers or dabblers or like to roost in it, like these flamingos here, give them those depth choices. You've got birds like harlequin ducks that half their year is spent in whitewater. Can you provide that whitewater? Again, knowing that natural history is critical. I really, again, if you take nothing from this, that natural history and planning around your natural history will create a much more effective enclosure and a much more robust enrichment program, in my opinion. So again, I keep going back to winter planning. Maybe it's just because it was a cold day here. But again, thinking about that winter planning, are your pumps, your waterfalls, all those things set up so that they can actually run all winter? Where's your pump pit going to be? Do you have enough power and water at the site? Will you filter the water? I think as we're all more aware of, you know, water conservation and wetlands conservation, you know, are there ways to reuse water? So we're not doing just dump and fill. Are there natural filters? Are there other ways that we can filter water that conserve water? And of course, safety first. Consider the risk of the birds that are seasonal. So for example, if you have catastrophic molters like waterfowl, can those birds, when they're flightless, get in and out of these water sources? Can young birds get out of them? Could an older debilitated bird get in and out? So for example, with this pochard here, I show that there's a very gradual slope into the water. That's great for all ages and for ducks that are highly aquatic that can push themselves out, and ducks that may be debilitated due to age or whatever it may be. So think about your gradients, and again, think about fledglings, molting birds, older birds, whatever it may be. And then feeders, and I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on feeders because feeding enrichment is a whole other ball of wax. My intent here is simply to think about how you would prepare for the most diverse feeding that you can. And again, thinking about your natural history is, where do these birds feed in the wild? And do they feed in the same manner throughout the year? Create that diversity in your enclosure to design so that you have the flexibility throughout the year to provide them with a more stimulating feeding resource. And there's tons of food-based enrichment. And again, I'm not going to get into that, but give yourself the breadth and depth of opportunity there with eye hooks, anchors, all those things that can support a full heavy feeder when you're using it. And these can be underwater, these could be vertical, these could be horizontal, whatever it might be. Just plan ahead on those, and it's going to be a lot easier for you. If you're using concrete, I really liked this idea that I saw where a shallow bowl was actually created inside the edge of a pool. so that soaked grain could be put in that to allow those birds to dabble and forage in there, and it could simply be rinsed out as part of the pond cleaning process. So just a really kind of cheap, easy idea that is a heck of a lot easier to install when you're pouring concrete than it is to chisel it back out. And then, of course, with feeders, you also want to think about your placement. Birds, I feel, are pretty messy eaters. They're about as messy as my child. But really, it's important to plan ahead on how you're going to deal with that messiness in a way that is effective. So here in the top right, we have some long-tailed ducks at a water feeder. It was placed in a level spot. If your pond banks are super angled, you're going to have a really hard time using some of these aquatic feeders. So think about that as you think about how your ponds may lay out so that aquatic birds can eat in the water. Here with these two SMU, you see that we created a aluminum frame for soaked grain. We did not have the foresight to pour molds into the concrete for those feeders I just showed you in the other slide, but these aluminum panels worked really well for holding that and allowed surface feeding ducks to get to that as well as diving ducks. Of course, if you're feeding messy feeders out of bowls, I thought this was a really fun idea to have the feeders actually at stations in the water. The feeders could obviously be picked up and cleaned and disinfected, but so could that ledge, and there wasn't a concern about pests or anything else occurring inside that space. And then, of course, floor drains. I think this is one that everyone on this call has thought, man, if I only had one more floor drain. They are really effective and really important to have as you start to plan ahead. Something that, you know, in every enclosure we've ever done, we've put in one, and I would like to have two, just because they are super, super important from a hygiene perspective. And if you don't have them, it's creating flat, level surfaces so that you could put down paper or some other cleanup manner. I think that's really important to have that kind of plan ahead of time when you're building these things. Of course, when you're retrofitting, it's really challenging, and I get that. But there's that planning ahead anytime you can do it. It's going to save you in the long run. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. There's my email address. If you'd like to reach out, welcome to talk more about this. And thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks, Ian. We have time for one or two questions. First question for you. In your experience, which is a better choice for avian enrichment in enclosure design, natural plantings or man-made structures?
The answer is yes. I'd say it's a combination of both, and it really depends on the species and the individuals you're looking at. It's really challenging, I think, to plan on just natural vegetation, depending again on the individuals, the enclosure, all of those things. But I think it really benefits the birds when you can create that complexity. At the same time, a lot of the hardware, the furniture, if you will, can have a lot of benefit too, because you can plan it a little bit better and use it for just more things. You can hang more things off of it. You can create shelters off of it. There's just a lot of rigidity and other structural abilities, I think, with artificial. So I'd say a combination of both is ideal.
Okay, for shelter, with the presence of HPAI, many of us are worried about contaminants getting through the roofs of enclosures, but also would like to offer access to sun and rain. Any suggestion?
It's a tough one. I would say the UV transmitting panels are a great resource, and you can look those up. They are not cheap, so I would not, in most cases, think that they would be a full roof option. But if you did want to enclose because of HPAI concerns, you could create those panels to get that UV access. I would also say that that's a situation where some of those thread-on Miss King, Mr. Heads, things like the soaker hose, either zip tied or adhered to the top of the enclosure in some manner that's safe for the birds, could replicate some of that natural rain if you're limited based on HPAI concerns.
Okay, thank you. What recommendations might you have for easy to clean or move structures, structural enrichment for rehabilitation settings? I'm sorry.
Sure, that's not my area of expertise for sure, but I would say that, you know, with birds that you're concerned about, you know, potentially falling off perches or maybe still recovering, that don't have full flight ability or balance ability or sight or whatever it might be, is to create perches that are low enough so that they really can't injure themselves, giving them areas where they can move away from employees or volunteers, move closer if they wish, but then also bedding those enclosures deep enough so that birds, if they do fall, are at lower risk of hurting themselves. And that bedding obviously has the same concerns and considerations about pest control and cleanliness and all those things.
Okay, thank you. If everyone could give Ian a reaction and thank him for his time today. We are going to see him in just a second on the panel.